The plasma cannon's heat signature vanished from Commander Kellen Voss's scanner, just as his emergency beacon died. 47 hours ago, he'd been leading a routine diplomatic mission to the Nexarian homeworld. Now he was alone, his escort, fleet scattered across 3 star systems, his ship's wreckage cooling in the methane swamps below. The Nexarians had seemed so civilized during first contact. Their crystalline cities gleamed like jewels against their purple sky. Their technology rivaled humanity's greatest achievements, and their leader, High Arbiter Ithal, had spoken of peaceful cooperation with eloquent charm. The trap had been perfect. Voss dragged himself through the acidic muck, his environmental suit's integrity down to 37%. The Nexarians hadn't bothered to pursue him after the ambush. Why would they? Their world was a death trap for humans' atmospheric pressure that would crush unprotected lungs, toxic gases that ate through standard filtration systems, and predators that had evolved to hunt in conditions that would kill most sentient species. Within minutes, he lost everything in the crash: his weapons, his communication array, his survival gear, all of it fused into slag by the Nexarian plasma bombardment. All except for one item he'd instinctively grabbed as his command module tore apart. A small titanium-reinforced container holding Earth's diplomatic flag. A simple thing of blue and white meant to symbolize humanity's peaceful intentions. The irony wasn't lost on him as he pressed deeper into the swamp, following the faint electromagnetic signatures that indicated civilization. The Nexarians had played the long game, spending months building trust with human diplomats while secretly analyzing their technology, their biology, their weaknesses. They learned everything they needed to know about humanity's military capabilities, their trade routes, their colony worlds. But they'd made one critical miscalculation. They'd assumed that capturing their ships and studying their technology would be enough to understand humans. They'd never bothered to learn what made humans dangerous when everything else was stripped away. As Voss reached the edge of the swamp, the first Nexarian patrol found him, 3 figures in gleaming armor, their insectoid forms moving with predatory grace. They spoke in their musical language, their mandibles clicking with what sounded like amusement. One of them, the leader, judging by the ornate patterns on his carapace, stepped forward and spoke in accented English. "Commander Voss, I presume. High Arbiter Ithal extends his compliments. Your sacrifice has provided us with much valuable data about human military doctrine." The Nexarian's compound eyes glittered with malicious intelligence. "We know about your colonies on Kepler 440b in Proxima Centauri. We know about your fleet concentrations at Wolf 359. We know about your classified weapons programs on Luna." Voss said nothing, but his mind raced. The intel they gathered was comprehensive, dangerously so. With that information, the Nexarians could strike at humanity's heart before Earth even knew the diplomatic mission had failed. "Nothing to say," the Nexarian continued. "How refreshingly humble. Don't worry, your death will serve a greater purpose. Your species will provide excellent subjects for our research once we've conquered your worlds. Your biological adaptability is quite remarkable, and your technological innovations show promise once properly guided by superior intellect." They secured him with neural dampeners that sent waves of agony through his nervous system. Then began the march toward their city. Voss counted their numbers, memorized their patrol patterns, cataloged their weapons and equipment. They treated him like a broken animal, never bothering to check if he was still analyzing, still planning. The Nexarian city rose before them, like a monument to hubris, spires of living crystal that pulsed with bioluminescent energy, graceful bridges that spanned impossible distances, and at its heart, a massive complex that could only be the High Arbiter's palace. Thousands of Nexarians moved through the streets, their society a perfect blend of organic beauty and technological mastery. As they dragged him through the city's entrance, Voss felt the weight of the flag container against his chest. The Nexarians had searched him for weapons, but they dismissed the diplomatic pouch as meaningless ceremony. They'd never considered that sometimes the most dangerous things came wrapped in symbols of peace. The High Arbiter's chamber was a cathedral of living crystal, its walls pulsing with data streams that showed star charts, fleet movements, and tactical analyses. Ithal himself was magnificent, nearly 3 meters tall, his carapace gleaming with precious metals, his forearms moving in complex patterns as he directed the invasion plans. "For human space, Commander Voss," Ithal's voice was like wind chimes in a hurricane. "How delightful to meet you properly. I trust your accommodations have been educational, Voss met his gaze steadily. I've learned enough. Indeed. And what have you learned? Little human, that you're about to make the biggest mistake in your species' history. Ethel's mandibles clicked with amusement. Fascinating. Please, enlighten me. Voss smiled, and for the first time since the ambush, he felt something other than desperation. He felt the cold, calculating fury that had carried humanity from the caves of Earth to the stars. You studied our ships. You studied our weapons. You studied our tactics. He paused, letting his words sink in. But you never studied us. The first Nyxarian died 3 hours after Voss was thrown into the detention complex. The facility was a masterwork of Nyxarian engineering, a crystalline maze buried deep beneath their capital city, designed to hold the most dangerous prisoners from across their stellar empire. The walls pulsed with bioelectric fields that could paralyze most nervous systems. The atmosphere was carefully regulated to weaken non-Nyxarian physiology, and the guards were enhanced warriors with combat modifications that made them faster, stronger, and more resilient than baseline Nyxarians. None of that mattered to Voss. He'd spent the first hour studying the facility's layout, memorizing guard rotations, and analyzing the bioelectric fields that powered the security systems. The second hour he'd used to prepare his body, purging his system of toxins through controlled breathing techniques learned from Tibetan monks and Spetsnaz trainers. The third hour he'd spent fashioning weapons from the supposedly harmless materials. In his cell, the guard who came to check on him was named Kithara. According to the chittering conversation Voss had overheard, she was young by Nyxarian standards, her carapace still showing the bright coloration of recent molting. She'd been assigned to the detention complex because it was considered safe duty. Who could escape from the most secure facility on the planet? Kithara's mistake was assuming that human engineering was limited to obvious tools. She never considered that a diplomatic flag, particularly one built to survive interstellar travel, might contain materials that could be repurposed by someone with the right knowledge and sufficient motivation. The titanium-reinforced container's lining could be separated into threads strong enough to strangle. The ceremonial pole could be broken down into components that, when properly configured, created a crude but effective electromagnetic pulse generator. The flag itself was woven with conductive fibers that could channel bioelectric fields in ways their Nyxarian designers never intended. When Kithara entered his cell, Voss was ready. The neural dampeners had been designed to incapacitate through pain, but Voss had learned to function through pain during his years in the Colonial Marines. He'd been shot, stabbed, burned, and broken more times than he could count. Pain was just another battlefield condition to be managed. Kithara's death was swift and silent. The improvised garrote cut through her exoskeleton at the joint between her neck and thorax, severing her primary neural cluster before she could scream. Her body convulsed once. Then, when still, Voss stripped her of her weapons: a plasma cutter, designed for precision work, a neural disruptor, and a small communicator. More importantly, he took her access codes, downloaded directly from her dying neural pathways using techniques that officially didn't exist in human military doctrine. The detention complex's security system was sophisticated, but it had been designed by a species that had never encountered human adaptability. The Nyxarians thought in terms of overwhelming force and technological superiority. They'd never learned to think like guerrilla fighters. Voss moved through the facility like a ghost, using maintenance shafts and service corridors that the guards assumed were too small for prisoners to navigate. He reached the main security station just as the second shift was beginning their rotation. Guard Captain Velthan was a veteran of the Nyxarian expansion wars, his carapace scarred from a dozen campaigns. He'd survived encounters with species that could manipulate gravity, others that could phase through solid matter, and even one that could exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. But he'd never fought humans before. The attack came from 3 directions at once. Voss had rigged the facility's bioelectric fields to create a cascading feedback loop, turning the prison's own security system into a weapon. The electromagnetic pulse from his improvised device disrupted the guards' enhanced nervous systems, while the plasma cutter carved through their formation like a blade through silk. Velthan managed to trigger the facility's alarm before Voss reached him, but by then it was too late. The human was already moving, already adapting, already turning every system in the complex against its designers. The battle in the security station lasted exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. When it was over, 6 Nyxarians were dead. The facility's main power grid was overloading, and Voss had access to the detention complex's entire prisoner database. He wasn't the only one being held here. The Nexarians had been busy in the months since first contact. They captured representatives from a dozen species, taking ambassadors, traders, and explorers who'd come to their world in good faith. Each prisoner was being studied, their biology analyzed, their technology reverse-engineered. But they'd made another mistake. They'd assumed that different species couldn't work together, that ancient evolutionary rivalries would prevent cooperation. They'd never considered that sometimes the enemy of your enemy really was your friend. Voss began systematically releasing the other prisoners, starting with the karate battle dancer who'd been captured during a cultural exchange. The karate were natural warriors, their entire society built around the art of combat. When Voss freed Zephyra, she looked at the dead Nexarians and smiled with all four of her mouths. "Human," she said in thickly accented standard, "you fight like karate. This is acceptable." Next came Braun, a hegemony engineer whose people had been enslaved by the Nexarians for their technical expertise. His cybernetic implants had been partially disabled by his captors, but he could still interface with their systems in ways they'd never anticipated. The pattern continued. Each species brought different skills, different perspectives, different ways of thinking about warfare and survival. The Vorthic contributed their ability to see across multiple spectrums of light. The Selenites brought their natural resistance to bioelectric fields. The Kari offered their pack hunting instincts and perfect coordination. But it was Voss who bound them together, who turned a collection of desperate prisoners into something approaching a fighting force. He'd learned their languages during the diplomatic mission, studied their cultures, understood their motivations. Now he used that knowledge to forge them into a weapon the Nexarians had never seen coming. The breakout from the detention complex was just the beginning. As alarms screamed through the crystalline city above, as Nexarian security forces mobilized to contain what they assumed was a simple prison riot, Voss was already planning the next phase of his campaign. He still carried the Flage container, its weight a constant reminder of what he'd lost and what he still had to accomplish. The Nexarians had taught him that sometimes diplomacy failed. Now he was going to teach them what humans did when diplomacy was no longer an option. The first shots of the war were fired as they breached the facility's outer perimeter. Plasma bolts lit up the underground complex like lightning, and the sound of screaming filled the air. But for the first time since the ambush, Voss felt something approaching hope. He wasn't alone anymore, and the Nexarians were about to learn why that made all the difference. The Nexarian response was swift and overwhelming. Within hours of the prison break, the city's crystal spires blazed with emergency lighting, and the streets filled with warrior caste, soldiers whose carapaces gleamed with combat modifications. High Arbiter Ithal had declared martial law, sealing the city's approaches and deploying hunter-killer teams, trained to track the most dangerous predators in known space. But their quarry had vanished into the city's underworld like smoke. Voss had learned about the Nexarian caste system during the diplomatic briefings. The warrior caste ruled the surface, their crystalline palaces built literally on top of the worker caste districts. Below them, in the forgotten tunnels and maintenance shafts that kept the city functioning, lived the outcast Nexarians who had been deemed genetically inferior, politically unreliable, or simply unlucky enough to be born with the wrong shell. Coloration. The Nexarian authorities had assumed these underclass citizens would turn in the escaped prisoners for rewards or recognition. They'd never considered that decades of oppression might have created a population ready to embrace anyone who could fight back against their oppressors. Voss found them in the geothermal processing plant that powered the city's lower levels. Hundreds of Nexarians whose shells bore the dull gray coloration of the worker caste, their bodies scarred from industrial accidents and chemical exposure. Their leader was an ancient female named Kellen whose mandibles had been damaged in a mining accident decades ago, leaving her speech slurred and her face permanently disfigured. "You are the human who killed the guards," she said, her damaged voice barely above a whisper. "The one who brings death to those who would make us slaves." "I'm the one who's going to burn their city to the ground," Voss replied. "The question is whether you're going to help me or hide in the dark while others fight for your freedom." Kellen's compound eyes glittered with an emotion. Voss recognized the cold fury of someone who'd been pushed afar for too long. "What do you need?" The transformation was remarkable. Within days, the forgotten tunnels became a warren of workshops and weapons caches. The worker caste Nexarians possessed an intimate knowledge of their city's infrastructure that their warrior caste oppressors had never bothered to learn. They knew which power conduits were vulnerable, which water supplies could be contaminated, which support structures were load-bearing. More importantly, they had access to the city's manufacturing base. The same industrial facilities that produced the Nexarians' advanced technology could be repurposed to create weapons, explosives, and equipment for the growing resistance movement. Braun, the hegemony engineer, worked closely with the Nexarian technicians to adapt their knowledge for warfare. His cybernetic implants, partially restored by underground medics, could interface with Nexarian systems in ways that bypassed their security protocols. Together, they began turning the city's own infrastructure into a weapon. The first major strike came during the shift change at the central power distribution facility. Zephyr led a team of karate and worker-caste Nexarians through the maintenance tunnels, their approach masked by the facility's own electromagnetic fields. The battle was brief, but devastating. 12 warrior-caste guards died in the first 30 seconds, their enhanced reflexes useless against enemies who knew the terrain intimately. When the power grid failed, 3 entire districts went dark. Emergency lighting flickered on, but the damage was done. The Nexarians' perfect crystalline city suddenly seemed fragile, vulnerable. High Arbiter Ithel's response was predictable in its brutality. He ordered mass arrests in the worker-caste districts, public executions of suspected collaborators, and the deployment of chemical weapons in the underground tunnels. Hundreds of innocent Nexarians died in the crackdown, their bodies left in the streets as a warning to others. But instead of breaking the resistance, the atrocities only fueled it. More worker-caste Nexarians joined the underground, bringing with them knowledge of the city's defenses and access to critical infrastructure. The resistance cells multiplied, becoming a hydra that grew to heads for everyone that was cut off. Voss moved through the city like a force of nature, striking at targets of opportunity and vanishing before the Nexarians could respond. He sabotaged communication networks, assassinated key commanders, and turned the city's own security systems against their operators. But his real genius lay in his ability to coordinate the diverse species and castes that made up his growing army. The Vorthek, with their multi-spectrum vision, became perfect scouts and snipers. The Selenites, immune to bioelectric fields, could move through areas that would incapacitate other species. The Carry hunted in packs, using their natural coordination to overwhelm isolated patrols. The worker-caste Nexarians provided intelligence, logistics, and intimate knowledge of the city's weaknesses. Each species brought their own military traditions, their own ways of thinking about warfare. Voss absorbed it all, creating a synthesis of tactics that was greater than the sum of its parts. He was no longer just a human fighting aliens. He was becoming something new, something that transcended the boundaries between species. The turning point came when they captured an Nexarian data core, containing detailed intelligence about their invasion plans for human space. The scope was breathtaking: simultaneous strikes on Earth, Mars, and every major human colony. The Nexarians had built a fleet of stealth vessels using stolen human technology, each one capable of bypassing defensive systems and delivering devastating first strikes. But the intelligence also revealed something else: the locations of other diplomatic missions that had been captured. The Nexarians had been conducting a galaxy-wide campaign of deception, using the same tactics they'd employed against humanity. Dozens of species had been betrayed, their representatives captured or killed, their military secrets stolen. Voss realized that the stakes were even higher than he'd imagined. This wasn't just about humanity's survival. It was about the future of every free species in the galaxy. The Nexarians weren't just conquering. They were conducting a systematic campaign of genocide, using their victims' own technology against them. The weight of that knowledge settled on his shoulders like a mantle of responsibility. He was no longer fighting for revenge, or even for survival. He was fighting for the principle that no species had the right to exterminate others. In the name of superiority. As he studied the invasion plans, Voss felt something shift inside him. The cold fury that had sustained him since the ambush transformed into something deeper, more focused. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a force of nature, a living embodiment of the universe's rejection of tyranny. The flag container, still pressed against his chest, its weight a constant reminder of his mission. But now it meant something different. It wasn't just a symbol of human diplomacy. It was a promise that some things were worth dying for, a promise that the strong didn't have the right to prey on the weak without consequence, a promise that the first human to land on their planet had come with nothing but would leave with their flag. Flying over the ruins of their empire, the war was about to begin in earnest. The first coordinated strike against the Nexarian military came at dawn, when the twin sons of their homeworld painted the crystal spires in shades of gold and crimson. Voss had spent weeks planning the assault, studying patrol patterns, identifying weak points, and positioning his forces for maximum impact. The target was the Orbital Defense Command Center, a massive complex that controlled the planetary shield, generators, and a fleet of automated defense platforms that protected the homeworld from invasion. If they could take it, they could prevent Nexarian reinforcements from reaching the planet, and more importantly, they could stop the invasion fleet from launching its attack on human space. Braun had identified the facility's critical vulnerability, the quantum entanglement communicators that linked the orbital platforms to the planetary command structure. The Nexarians had built redundancy into their system, but all the backup channels ran through a single heavily shielded conduit that passed through the facility's lower levels. The assault began with a diversionary attack on the city's main spaceport. Zephyr led 200 karate warriors and worker caste Nexarians in a frontal assault that drew the garrison's attention away from the real target. Plasma fire lit up the pre-dawn sky as the defenders rushed to repel what they assumed was a desperate attempt to steal spacecraft, but the real attack came from below. Voss had spent days mapping the geothermal tunnels that ran beneath the command center, using seismic sensors to identify the exact location of the communication conduit. The worker caste Nexarians had provided detailed schematics of the facility's construction, including the access points that maintenance crews used to service the deep infrastructure. The infiltration team moved like ghosts through the tunnels, their approach masked by the facility's own electromagnetic fields. Voss led the way, followed by a carefully selected group of specialists from different species. Each member had been chosen for specific skills that would be crucial to the mission's success. The Vorthix Scout, the Sarian, used her multi-spectrum vision to identify guards and sensors long before they could detect the infiltrators. Her natural camouflage abilities allowed her to move through areas that would be impossible for other species to navigate undetected. Behind her came the Selenites, their crystalline bodies immune to the bioelectric fields that powered the facility's security systems. They could disable sensors and override locks without triggering the automated defenses. The Curry Pack Hunters, led by an alpha named Growl in the Night, provided close combat expertise and perfect tactical coordination. Their ability to communicate through subsonic vocalizations meant they could coordinate attacks without alerting enemies. And at the center of it all was Voss, the human who had somehow learned to speak the languages of war in a dozen different dialects. He'd absorbed the tactical doctrines of every species under his command, creating a hybrid approach to warfare that no enemy could predict or counter. They reached the communication conduit just as the diversionary attack reached its peak. The facility's defenders were focused on the external threat, leaving the deep infrastructure lightly guarded. But the Nexarians had still posted elite sentries at the critical access points, warriors whose combat modifications made them nearly superhuman in their reflexes and strength. The first sentry died without knowing he was under attack. The Sarian's natural camouflage and the carry's perfect coordination allowed them to approach within striking distance before the Nexarian even sensed their presence. The kill was swift and silent, a blade between shell segments that severed his spinal cord instantly, but the second sentry was more alert. His enhanced hearing picked up the sound of his colleague's death, and his tactical implants immediately began broadcasting an alert to the facility's security center. He managed to draw his weapon and fire 3 shots before Voss reached him. The plasma bolts missed their intended targets, but they struck the conduit housing with devastating effect. The quantum entanglement communicators were shielded against electromagnetic interference, but they were vulnerable to direct physical damage. The housing cracked, and exotic matter began leaking into the surrounding atmosphere. Voss realized instantly that the mission parameters had changed. The communicators were damaged, but not destroyed. They would fail within hours, but that might be delayed to prevent the invasion fleet from launching. They needed to complete the sabotage manually, and that meant getting close enough to the exotic matter to place shaped charges directly on the quantum entanglement cores. Exotic matter was lethal to most organic life forms. The Nexarians used it in their most advanced weapons precisely because it was so dangerous. It could disrupt biological processes at the quantum level, causing cellular structures to collapse into random configurations. Exposure meant certain death, usually within minutes. But humans had evolved on a planet where radiation exposure was just another environmental hazard. Their cellular repair mechanisms were more robust than most species, and their immune systems were designed to handle massive cellular damage. Voss might survive long enough to complete the sabotage. If he was lucky, the Selenites volunteered to go with him. Their crystalline biology was naturally resistant to quantum disruption, and they could survive exposure levels that would kill any organic being. Together, they entered the damaged conduit housing while the rest of the team provided security. The interior was a hellscape of twisted metal and leaking energy. The quantum entanglement cores pulsed with malevolent light, their exotic matter. Containment fields failing in cascading waves. The air itself seemed to shimmer with malign intent, and Voss could feel his cellular structure beginning to deteriorate within seconds of exposure. But he'd survived worse. The colonial Marines had trained him to function in environments that would kill unprotected humans: vacuum, radiation, extreme temperatures. He'd learned to push his body beyond its theoretical limits, to keep fighting even when biological systems began to fail. The Selenites worked with crystalline precision, their natural immunity to quantum effects allowing them to place the shaped charges with mathematical accuracy. Each explosive was positioned to maximize damage to the quantum entanglement cores, while minimizing the risk of a catastrophic exotic matter release. Voss felt his vision beginning to blur as cellular damage accumulated. His hands shook as he armed the detonators, but his training held. The colonial Marines had taught him that sometimes the mission was more important than the individual, that some things were worth dying for. The charges detonated in a sequence timed to the nanosecond, each explosion building on the last to create a cascading failure in the quantum entanglement network. The communication conduit collapsed in on itself, its exotic matter containment fields failing completely. The blast waved through Voss against the tunnel wall with bone-breaking force. His environmental suit was breached in a dozen places, and he could taste blood in his mouth. But the mission was complete. The orbital defense platforms were now isolated from planetary command, their automated systems unable to receive new orders or coordinate their responses. As the team fought their way back to the surface, Voss could feel his body beginning to shut down. The exotic matter exposure had damaged him at the cellular level, and his regenerative systems were failing. But he'd bought them time for the rest of his forces to exploit the confusion. Time to prevent the invasion fleet from launching. The Nexarians' response was swift and brutal. When they realized what had happened, High Arbiter Ithal ordered a systematic purge of the worker caste districts. Thousands of innocent Nexarians were executed in the streets, their bodies left as a warning to others who might consider supporting the resistance. But the purge only hardened the resolve of those who remained. The worker caste Nexarians had nothing left to lose, and they threw themselves into the fight with the desperation of those who knew they were already dead. The resistance cells multiplied, spreading through the city like a virus. And in the deep tunnels beneath the city, Voss lay dying but not yet dead. The exotic matter had damaged him beyond any normal being's ability to survive, but humans had always been remarkably difficult to kill. His cellular repair mechanisms were working overtime, fighting a losing battle against quantum disruption, but buying him precious time. Time to plan the next phase of the war. Time to turn the Nexarians' own weapons against them. Time to show them what happened when they made the mistake of thinking that humans were just another species to be conquered. The flag container still pressed against his chest, its weight a constant reminder of his mission. Soon, he would plant that flag in the heart of their greatest stronghold. Soon, he would show them that the first human to land on their planet had come with nothing, but would leave with everything. The siege of the Crystal Citadel began 3 weeks after the destruction of the Orbital Defense Command Center. Voss had used the time to heal his body's stubborn refusal to die from exotic matter poisoning, had become the stuff of legend among the resistance forces. The worker caste Nexarians whispered that he was unkillable, that he'd absorbed the very essence of their oppressors' weapons and turned it into strength. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. Voss had learned to weaponize his own dying. The exotic matter exposure had changed him at the cellular level, turning his body into a living weapon against Nexarian biotechnology. Their neural disruptors couldn't affect him. Their bioelectric fields actually energized him, and their chemical weapons were neutralized by his altered physiology. He'd become something unprecedented, a human who could survive in environments specifically designed to kill his species. But the real change was in his mind. The exotic matter had damaged more than just his cellular structure. It had torn away the psychological barriers that normally limited human aggression. He no longer felt fear, doubt, or mercy. He felt only the cold, calculating fury of a predator, whose prey had finally revealed itself. The Crystal Citadel was the Nexarians' greatest stronghold, a mountain-sized fortress that housed their military command, their weapons development facilities, and their primary data archives. Its walls were grown from living crystal that could regenerate damage. Its defenses were powered by exotic matter reactors, and its garrison consisted of 10,000 elite warriors who'd never known defeat. High Arbiter Ithal had retreated there when the Resistance's attacks made the capital city untenable. He brought with him the complete archives of their galactic intelligence network, the command codes for their invasion fleets, and the genetic templates they'd stolen from dozens of conquered species. If Voss could take the Citadel, he could cripple the Nexarian war machine across the entire galaxy. The assault force was the largest military formation in the planet's history, not because of its size, but because of its unprecedented diversity. 50,000 beings from 37 different species, united by their hatred of Nexarian oppression and their faith in the human commander who'd given them hope. The Karate had contributed their entire warrior caste, 20,000 battle dancers, whose combat skills were legendary throughout the galaxy. The Vorthik had sent hunter killers whose multi-spectrum vision could see through any camouflage. The Selenites had provided their crystal singers, whose harmonic abilities could shatter Nexarian bioarmor. Even species that had never worked together before found common ground in their desire to see the Nexarian Empire burn. But the core of the army was the worker caste Nexarians themselves. They'd numbered in the hundreds of thousands before the purges, but Ithal's brutal reprisals had reduced their population to barely 50,000 survivors. They were all that remained of their caste, and they knew that defeat meant extinction. They fought with the desperate fury of those who had nothing left to lose. The battle began before dawn, when the first siege engines emerged from the underground tunnels that honeycombed the Citadel's foundation. The worker caste engineers had spent weeks preparing these weapons, massive boring machines, repurposed for mining operations, armed with plasma cutters and shaped charges that could crack the Citadel. As living crystal walls, the Nexarian defenders responded with overwhelming firepower, their exotic matter weapons turning the mountain slopes into a hellscape of twisted space-time. But the attackers had learned from previous battles. They moved in small, coordinated groups that presented no single target, using the terrain and their knowledge of Nexarian tactics to minimize casualties. Nexarian led the Vorthik hunters in a flanking maneuver through the Citadel's outer defenses, her multi-spectrum vision allowing her to identify weak points in the crystalline walls. Her warriors struck with surgical precision, their natural camouflage rendering them invisible until they were close enough to strike. The first line of defense fell within an hour, but the cost was enormous. 3,000 Karate warriors died in the initial assault, their bodies shattered by exotic matter weapons that unmade them at the quantum level. The Vorthik hunters suffered 40% casualties, their natural abilities useless against enemies who could see in spectrums they couldn't imagine. But the attackers pressed forward, driven by a fury that transcended species barriers. They'd all suffered under Nexarian oppression, all lost friends and family to the Empire's brutal expansion. This was their chance for revenge, their opportunity to strike back at the beings who treated them as animals to be studied and discarded. The second line of defense was stronger, anchored by the Citadel's primary weapon systems, massive plasma cannons that could vaporize entire formations, bioelectric fields that could paralyze attacking forces, and swarms of automated drones that hunted anything that moved. The attackers advanced slow to a crawl as they fought through overlapping fields of fire. Voss led the main assault personally, his altered physiology allowing him to walk through weapon systems that would kill anyone else. The Nexarian defenders focused their fire on him, recognizing the threat he represented. Plasma bolts that should have vaporized him instead seemed to energize him, and bioelectric fields that should have paralyzed him actually enhanced his reflexes. But even his enhanced durability had limits. A direct hit from an exotic matter cannon threw him backward, his body smoking from quantum disruption. For a moment, the attack faltered as the diverse species that made up his army wondered if their seemingly invincible leader had finally fallen. Then Voss stood up, his body wreathed in exotic matter energy that should have been lethal. He'd learned to metabolize the Nexarians' most dangerous weapons, turning their own power against them. He was no longer entirely human, he was something new, something that had never existed before in the galaxy's history. The sight of their leader's resurrection sent a shockwave through the attacking forces. The karate battle dancers screamed their war cries and threw themselves at the defensive lines. With renewed fury, the worker caste Nexarians fought like demons, their knowledge of the Citadel's construction allowing them to exploit every weakness. The second line of defense held for 6 hours before finally breaking. The cost was appalling, another 5,000 dead, including Growl in the Night and half his curry pack. But the attackers had reached the Citadel's main gates, and the defenders were running out of positions to fall back to. The third line of defense was the Citadel itself, the ancient fortress city that had stood unconquered for 1,000 years. Its walls were 100 meters thick, grown from living crystal that could repair battle damage within minutes. Its defenders were the elite of the Nexarian military, warriors whose genetic modifications made them living weapons. But the attackers had one advantage their enemies couldn't match. They had nothing left to lose. The karate warriors danced through the Citadel's corridors, their movements a deadly art form that turned combat into performance. The Vortic hunters stalked their prey through the crystalline passages, their natural abilities allowing them to see threats before they could strike. The worker caste Nexarians fought with the fury of the oppressed, finally given their chance for justice. They knew every passage, every hidden entrance, every structural weakness of the fortress they'd helped build with their own hands. Their intimate knowledge of the Citadel's construction turned every corridor into a killing ground. The battle for the Citadel's interior was unlike anything in recorded galactic history. 37 different species, each with their own combat doctrines and natural abilities, fought as a unified force against defenders who'd never faced such diversity. The Nexarians' tactical computers couldn't process the complexity of the assault. They'd been programmed to fight conventional armies, not this hybrid nightmare that adapted to their every countermeasure, floor by floor, room by room. The attackers carved their way through the fortress. The crystalline walls ran red with the blood of a dozen species, and the air filled with the screams of the dying. Neither side asked for quarter, and none was given. This was a war of extinction, and everyone knew it. The Selenites proved crucial in the close quarters fighting. Their harmonic abilities could shatter Nexarian bioarmor, while their crystalline bodies were nearly immune to the defenders' energy weapons. They sang their death songs as they fought, their harmonics turning the Citadel's own crystal structure into a weapon against its builders. But the defenders fought with equal desperation. These were the survivors of 1,000 conquests, warriors who'd built an empire on the bones of lesser species. They'd never considered the possibility of defeat, and the reality of it drove them to acts of unprecedented savagery. Commander Vectos, the Citadel's military governor, ordered the activation of the fortress's final defense system, a bioweapon that would sterilize the entire structure, killing attacker and defender alike. He'd rather see his stronghold become a tomb than allow it to fall to what he considered inferior species. The weapon's activation sent waves of lethal radiation through the Citadel's corridors. Hundreds of attackers died instantly, their cellular structure collapsing as exotic particles tore through their bodies. The assault seemed to falter as entire formations were wiped out by the invisible death that flowed through the fortress. But Voss was still alive, still fighting, still absorbing the Nexarians' deadliest weapons and turning them into strength. The bioweapon that should have killed him instead energized him further, his altered physiology converting lethal radiation into raw power. He became a beacon of hope in the darkness, a living proof that the Nexarians weren't invincible. Following his example, the survivors pressed forward. The karate warriors danced through the lethal radiation, their enhanced reflexes allowing them to dodge the worst of the effects. The Vortic hunters used their multi-spectrum vision to identify safe paths through the contaminated zones. The worker caste Nexarians, driven by generations of rage, simply endured the pain and kept fighting. The final assault on the Citadel's command center cost another 8,000 lives. The corridors leading to High Arbiter Ithal's sanctuary were defended by the last of the Nexarian elite, warriors who'd been modified to superhuman levels of strength and speed. They fought like demons, their desperation matching that of their attackers. But in the end, numbers and determination proved stronger than individual superiority. The command center's blast doors, designed to withstand planetary bombardment, finally gave way to the combined assault of 37 different species. The sound of tearing metal echoed through the fortress like a death knell. When the last defender fell, the survivors stood in the ruins of what had been the Nixarian Empire's greatest stronghold. Of the 50,000 who'd begun the assault, barely 15,000 remained alive. The crystalline floors were carpeted with the dead, and the air was thick with the smoke of burning biotechnology. But they'd won. The crystal citadel had fallen, and with it, the heart of Nixarian power. The surviving attackers looked to their human leader, waiting to see what he would do with the victory they purchased with so much blood. Voss stood in the center of the command chamber, his body still wreathed in exotic matter energy. In his hands, he held the flag container that had somehow survived the entire campaign. The simple blue and white banner of Earth seemed almost anticlimactic after everything they'd endured, but as he looked around at the diverse faces of his followers, karate warriors, Vorthic hunters, selenite crystal singers, and worker caste Nixarians who finally found their freedom, he realized that the flag had become something more than a symbol of human diplomacy. It had become a banner of liberation, a promise that no species had to face oppression alone. The hardest battle was still ahead. High Arbiter Ithal had escaped deeper into the Citadel's depths, taking with him the command codes for the invasion fleets and the genetic templates of every species the Nixarians had conquered. If he managed to escape, the war would continue across the galaxy, but for now, Voss allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The first human to land on the Nixarian homeworld had indeed come with nothing. But he wouldn't leave empty-handed. He would leave with their flag flying over the ruins of their empire, and the knowledge that sometimes the underdog wins. The pursuit into the Citadel's deep core took them through passages that defied conventional architecture. The Nixarians had built their greatest fortress around an ancient artifact, a crystalline structure of unknown origin that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Its corridors twisted through space in ways that hurt to contemplate, and its walls pulsed with energies that predated the Nixarian civilization by millions of years. High Arbiter Ithal had fled to the artifact's heart, where the Nixarians had built their most sacred chamber, the Hall of Genetic Mastery. It was here that they stored the biological templates of every species they conquered, the living essence of civilizations they destroyed. It was also here that they built their most powerful weapon, a quantum transmitter capable of broadcasting genetic viruses to any world in the galaxy. Voss led the surviving attackers through the twisted passages, his altered physiology allowing him to navigate spaces that would drive normal beings insane. Behind him came the remnants of his army, barely 3,000 survivors from the original 50,000, but they were the hardest, most determined fighters from 37 different species. Thessarian, her multi-spectrum vision clouded by the artifact's dimensional distortions, stayed close to Voss as they moved through corridors that seemed to shift when observed directly. "Human," she whispered, "this place is wrong. It exists in too many dimensions. We shouldn't be able to survive here." "We're not supposed to survive any of this," Voss replied, his voice carrying the weight of everything they'd endured. "But we're still here. That has to count for something." The first trap nearly killed them all. The corridor they were traversing suddenly folded in on itself, creating a spatial anomaly that threatened to compress their bodies into quantum foam. Only the quick thinking of the selenite crystal singers saved them. Their harmonic abilities somehow resonated with the artifact's frequency, creating a protective field that allowed them to escape. But the traps were just the beginning. As they penetrated deeper into the artifact's heart, they encountered the Nixarian's final guardians, beings that were no longer entirely organic. Ithal had sacrificed his most loyal followers to the artifact's power, transforming them into living weapons that existed partially outside normal space-time. These guardian wraiths were nightmarish opponents. They could phase through solid matter, strike from multiple dimensions simultaneously, and their very presence caused reality to fracture around them. The surviving attackers fought desperately against enemies that seemed to violate the basic laws of physics. Zephyra, the karate battle dancer, died fighting the first guardian wraith they encountered. Her legendary combat skills were useless against an enemy that could attack from dimensions she couldn't perceive. She fell with 4 of her mouths still singing war songs, her body dissolving into quantum static as the creature's dimensional claws tore through her essence. The Vorthic hunters fared better, their multi-spectrum vision allowing them to partially track the wraith's movements across dimensions. But even they suffered heavy casualties as the Guardians exploited every weakness in 3-dimensional thinking. It was the worker caste Nixarians who provided the key to defeating the wraiths. Their intimate knowledge of the artifact's construction, revealed that the Guardians were still partially anchored to the physical dimension through bioneural links. If those links could be severed, the race would be trapped in their dimensional prison. The battle to destroy the neural anchor points cost another 1,000 lives. The surviving attackers threw themselves at the crystalline nodes with suicidal determination, knowing that each anchor destroyed would weaken the Guardians. The Selenites sang their crystal-shattering harmonics until their voices broke, their songs turning the artifact's own structure against its Guardians. When the last anchor point fell, the Guardian race let out screams that echoed across multiple dimensions before dissolving into quantum foam. The path to the Hall of Genetic Mastery was finally open, but only 2,000 attackers remained alive to walk it. The hall itself was a cathedral of crystalline horror, its walls lined with the genetic essence of extinct civilizations. Thousands of species that had once flourished across the galaxy were now reduced to data patterns, stored in biocrystalline matrices. The Nexarians had preserved their genetic templates not out of respect, but as trophies of their conquests. At the center of the hall stood High Arbiter Ithal, but he was no longer the elegant being Voss had first met. The artifact's power had changed him, transforming him into something that existed partially outside normal reality. His form shifted and wavered, sometimes appearing as a traditional Nexarian, sometimes as a writhing mass of tentacles and eyes that hurt to look at directly. So Ithal's voice seemed to come from every direction at once. The little human has finally reached me. I must admit, I didn't expect you to survive this long. Your species shows more resilience than our projections indicated. Voss stepped forward, the flag container still clutched in his hand. Around him, the survivors of his army spread out in a loose circle, their weapons trained on the transformed Arbiter. But they all knew that conventional weapons would be useless against a being that could manipulate reality itself. "It's over, Ithal," Voss said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen too much death to be intimidated by anything. "Your empire is finished. Your fleets are scattered. Your people are free." Ithal's laughter was the sound of dimensions grinding against each other. "Free, oh, my dear human. You understand so little. The Nexarian Empire was never about conquest. For its own sake, we were gardeners, pruning the galaxy of inferior species so that the worthy could flourish. And now, thanks to your interference, that pruning must become more aggressive." The quantum transmitter at the hall center began to glow with malevolent energy. Through its crystalline structure, Voss could see star maps showing the locations of every inhabited world in the galaxy. The device was preparing to broadcast a genetic virus that would sterilize entire star systems, wiping out every species the Nexarians deemed unworthy. "You forced my hand," Ithal continued, his form becoming more unstable as he channeled the artifact's power. "I had planned to preserve some of the more interesting species for further study, but if they cannot be controlled, they must be eliminated. The galaxy will be cleansed, and from its ashes, a new order will rise, one guided by true wisdom rather than the chaos of diverse evolution." The transmitter's charge was building toward critical levels. Within minutes, it would broadcast death to 1 billion worlds. The genetic templates stored in the hall's walls would be the only survivors preserved specimens of extinct civilizations that would be used to repopulate the galaxy according to Nexarian design. But Voss had spent months studying Nexarian technology, learning how their biosystems operated. He'd noticed something that Ithal, in his arrogance, had overlooked. The quantum transmitter wasn't just capable of broadcasting genetic viruses. It could also receive them, and Voss's body, altered by exotic matter exposure, had become a living reservoir of quantum-active genetic material. "You're right about one thing," Voss said, moving closer to the transmitter despite the lethal radiation it was emitting. "This is about pruning inferior species, but you got the wrong species." He opened the flag container and removed the simple blue and white banner. Inside, the flag was just fabric and metal, nothing special by galactic standards. But it had been woven with conductive fibers, reinforced with titanium, and treated with compounds that made it resistant to exotic matter exposure. It was a perfect antenna for quantum frequencies. Voss wrapped the flag around his arm and stepped into the transmitter's energy field. The pain was indescribable. His cellular structure began breaking down at the quantum level, his nervous system overloading as exotic particles tore through his body. But he'd learned to weaponize his own destruction, to turn the process of dying into a weapon against his enemies. His altered genetics, twisted by months of exotic matter exposure, began resonating with the transmitter's frequency. Instead of broadcasting Ethel's genocide virus, the device began receiving the genetic chaos that Voss had become. The quantum patterns that made up his essence flooded into the transmitter systems, overloading its crystalline matrices with biological impossibilities. "What are you doing?" Ethel screamed, his form becoming more unstable as the transmitter's malfunction affected the entire artifact. "You're destroying everything, the genetic templates, the transmitter, the artifact itself. That's the idea." Voss replied, his voice growing weaker as his body began to dissolve. "You wanted to prune the galaxy. Let me show you what happens when humans decide to do the pruning." The transmitter exploded in a cascade of quantum energy that tore through the hall of genetic mastery like a dimensional storm. The crystalline matrices containing the genetic templates of extinct species shattered, their preserved essence dissolving into quantum foam. The artifact itself began to collapse as its fundamental structures were undermined by the genetic chaos Voss had introduced. Ethel's final scream echoed across multiple dimensions as his transformed body was caught in the cascade. Failure. He tied his existence to the artifact's power, and now the power was turning against him. His form dissolved into quantum static, his consciousness scattered across dimensions where it would spend eternity experiencing the death of every species he'd exterminated. The explosion spread through the Citadel like a wave of liberation, freeing the biotechnology from its Nexarian programming and allowing the crystalline structures to return to their natural state. The fortress that had stood as a monument to oppression began to transform, its living walls remembering older purposes as they shed their weaponized configurations. As the quantum storm subsided, the survivors found themselves in a transformed space. The Hall of Genetic Mastery had become something entirely different, a garden of crystal flowers that sang with the voices of the liberated dead. The genetic templates weren't destroyed, but transformed, their essence freed from Nexarian control to evolve in ways their creators never intended. At the center of it all, Voss knelt beside the quantum transmitter's remains, his body held together by will and stubborn human refusal to die. The flag was still wrapped around his arm, its blue and white fabric somehow unmarked by the energies that had torn through the hall. The surviving attackers gathered around their leader, watching as he slowly stood on legs that should no longer have been able to support his weight. He paid the ultimate price for victory, but he was still alive, still human, despite everything the Nexarians had done to him. "Is it over?" the Sarian asked, her multi-spectrum vision showing her the quantum resonances that still echoed through the transformed space. Voss looked around at the crystal garden that had once been a tomb of extinct species. In the distance, he could hear the sound of the Citadel's structures reshaping themselves, shedding their military configurations to become something new. The Nexarian Empire's greatest stronghold was becoming a monument to freedom instead of oppression, for now, he replied, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too much to believe in easy endings. But this was just the beginning. There are other worlds out there, other species that need to be freed. And there are other empires that think they have the right to decide who lives and who dies. He looked down at the flag still wrapped around his arm, its simple design somehow more meaningful after everything they'd endured. It was no longer just a symbol of human diplomacy, it had become a promise that no species would face extinction alone, that somewhere in the galaxy, there were beings willing to fight for the principle that diversity was strength, not weakness. The first human to land on the Nexarian homeworld had indeed come with nothing but peaceful intentions, but he would leave with their flag flying over the transformed remains of their greatest stronghold, and the knowledge that sometimes the most powerful weapon against tyranny was the simple refusal to accept that some beings were worth more than others. 6 months after the fall of the Crystal Citadel, the transformation of the Nexarian homeworld was complete. The crystalline cities had shed their military configurations, their living walls flowing into new shapes that served life rather than domination. Where once warrior-caste Nexarians had strutted through gleaming corridors, now beings from dozens of species worked together to rebuild a civilization based on cooperation rather than conquest. Voss stood on the observation deck of the newly christened Liberation Station, watching as the last of the Nexarian prison ships was converted into a medical facility. His body bore the scars of his impossible survival, exotic matter burns that glowed faintly in certain light spectrums, quantum fractures that made his reflection shimmer like a heat mirage. He should have died a dozen times over, but human stubbornness had proven stronger than alien physics. The karate delegation has arrived, Kellen announced, her damaged mandibles clicking with what might have been amusement. The former worker caste leader had become the planet's first democratically elected governor, chosen by representatives from all the species that now called the world home. Voss nodded, still staring out at the transformed landscape. The Koradi had come to formally thank him for avenging their fallen warriors, but he found their gratitude harder to bear than their casualties. Victory always came with a price, and the price for freeing the galaxy had been measured in the lives of beings who trusted him to lead them home. The memorial wall in the station's central hub bore the names of every being who died in the campaign, 57,000 individuals from 37 species, each one represented by a holographic projection that showed them as they lived, rather than how they died. Zephyr danced eternal battle forms, heard from mouths singing war songs that would never end. Growl in the 900 through forests of light, his pack forever at his side. The Sarian stalked through prismatic displays that showed all the spectrums of light she'd used to guide them through darkness. But the memorial wasn't just about the dead. It was about what they'd accomplished, what their sacrifice had purchased. For the galaxy, the Nexarian Empire was finished, its fleets scattered or surrendered, its conquered worlds free to determine their own destinies. More importantly, the galaxy had learned that different species could fight together, could trust each other enough to die for strangers who didn't even share their evolutionary history. Commander. Ron's voice carried the electronic harmonics of his partially restored cybernetic implants. The hegemony engineer had become the station's chief technical officer, his skills crucial to integrating the diverse technologies that various species brought to their shared civilization. We're receiving a priority transmission from Earth. Voss turned from the observation window, his quantum-scarred features showing no emotion. He'd been expecting this call for weeks, ever since the first human ships had arrived to assess the situation. The Terran Federation had sent diplomats, scientists, and military observers to determine what their lost commander had accomplished in the depths of alien space. The holographic display activated, showing the familiar face of Admiral Chen Martinez, his former commanding officer and one of the few humans who understood what the diplomatic mission to the Nexarians really meant. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Voss could see the questions in her eyes. Commander Voss, she said, her voice carrying across the light years with crystal clarity. The Federation Council has asked me to convey their appreciation for your efforts in the Nexarian system. Your actions have prevented what could have been a devastating war. The war already happened, Admiral, Voss replied, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too much death to be impressed by political language. The question is whether humanity learned anything from it. Martinez paused, her expression shifting to something more personal. The Council is concerned about the reports we've received, the integration of multiple species into a single political entity, the technological sharing agreements, the unusual nature of your survival. They're questioning whether you're still fit for command. Voss almost smiled at that. The Federation Council was worried about him, about what he'd become during his time in the deep dark between stars. They saw the quantum scars, the impossible survival, the way he turned an entire planet into a laboratory for interspecies cooperation. They were afraid he'd gone native, that he'd forgotten his loyalty to humanity in favor of some larger ideal. Tell the Council, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen the galaxy's true face, that I'm exactly what they made me. A human who refuses to accept that some beings are worth more than others. A soldier who learned that sometimes the best way to serve your species is to fight for everyone's right to exist. He paused, looking around at the diverse faces that surrounded him. Nexarians and Koradi, Vorthic and Selenites, beings from species that had been enemies for millennia now working together to build something unprecedented. And tell them that, if they want to understand what I've become, they're welcome to send observers. But they should know that this world doesn't belong to humanity anymore. It belongs to everyone who is willing to fight for it. The transmission ended, leaving Voss alone with his thoughts and the weight of what he'd accomplished. The flag container still rested on his desk, its simple titanium construction unchanged despite everything it had survived. Inside, the blue and white banner bore new additions, patches of fabric from the clothing of fallen warriors, threads from the banners of liberated species, fragments of crystal from the transformed citadel. It was no longer just Earth's flag. It had become something larger, a symbol of the principle that diversity was strength, that cooperation could triumph over conquest. The first human to land on the Nexarian homeworld had indeed come with nothing but peaceful intentions, but he was leaving with something far more valuable than territory or resources. He was leaving with proof that the galaxy's future didn't have to be written in the blood of the conquered, that different species could find common ground without abandoning what made them unique. That sometimes the most powerful weapon against tyranny was the simple recognition that everyone deserved the right to exist. A soft chime indicated an incoming message from the planet's surface. The holographic display showed a group of young beings, Nexarians, humans, Korati, and others working together on some kind of engineering project. They looked up at the camera with expressions of excitement and hope, their different physiologies united by their shared enthusiasm for creation rather than destruction. Commander Voss, one of them said, a young Nexarian whose shell showed the bright coloration of recent molting. We wanted to show you what we've been working on. It's a new kind of quantum communicator that can translate not just language, but thought patterns between different species. We think it could help prevent the kind of misunderstandings that led to the war. Voss studied the young faces on the display, seeing in them the future he'd fought to create. They didn't think in terms of species superiority or evolutionary hierarchy. They saw problems to be solved, challenges to be overcome, wonders to be discovered. They were living proof that the sacrifice of 5,000 to 7,000 beings had not been in vain. Show me, he said, and for the first time in months, his scarred features showed something approaching peace. As the young scientists began explaining their project, Voss felt the weight of command finally beginning to lift from his shoulders. He carried the responsibility for so many lives, made decisions that determined the fate of entire species. But now, watching the next generation work together to build something better than what they'd inherited, he realized that his real victory wasn't the fall of the Nexarian Empire. His real victory was the simple fact that these young beings could look at the galaxy and see potential instead of threat, cooperation instead of conquest. They were the living embodiment of everything he'd fought for. The proof that sometimes the most important battles were fought not for territory or resources, but for the right to imagine a better future. The flag container sat on his desk, its weight a constant reminder of how far he'd traveled from the diplomatic mission that had brought him to this world. He'd started as a soldier carrying a symbol of human ambition. He was ending as something unprecedented, a guardian of the principle that the strong had no right to prey upon the weak, that diversity was a strength to be celebrated rather than a weakness to be exploited. The first human to land on the Nexarian homeworld had come with nothing but peaceful intentions and a simple flag. He would leave with that flag transformed into something greater than any single species could claim, a banner of liberation that represented every being willing to fight for the right to exist, to grow, to reach for the stars without fear of extinction. In the end, that was humanity's greatest gift to the galaxy, not superior technology or military might, but the stubborn refusal to accept that some lives mattered more than others. It was a lesson written in blood and sacrifice, purchased with the lives of beings who trusted a human commander to lead them towards something better than what they'd known. As the twin suns set over the transformed world, painting the crystal cities in shades of gold and crimson, Voss allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The war was over, the galaxy was free, and somewhere among the stars, other species were learning that they didn't have to face the darkness alone. The flag would fly over this world forever, not as a symbol of conquest, but as a promise that as long as there were beings willing to fight for freedom, tyranny would never have the final word. And in the end, that was the most human thing of all, the simple, stubborn refusal to give up hope, no matter how dark the universe became.